Henry Ford was born on a muddy farm outside Detroit, with no fortune, no elite education, and no reason to believe he would ever matter. But the boy who spent his nights taking apart watches in rural Michigan would eventually build Ford Motor Company, create one of the most powerful industrial empires on Earth, and change the way human beings moved forever. Long before highways, dealerships, or billion-dollar factories carried his name, Henry Ford was just a frustrated farm kid who hated the life waiting for him. And that hatred became the beginning of everything. What makes this story so incredible is not just the success, it is the number of times Henry Ford failed before the world finally listened. He lost companies, investors turned against him, and competitors mocked his obsession with cheap cars for ordinary people. But one decision after another slowly transformed him from a forgotten mechanic into one of the richest and most influential men alive. If you're into real stories of power, money, and transformation, subscribe. Because what happened next started on a lonely farm in Michigan, where a boy quietly decided he wanted a completely different life. 1. The farm boy who could not accept his future. Henry Ford was born in 1863 in Dearborn, Michigan, to Irish immigrant parents who had fought their way out of poverty after the potato famine destroyed lives across Ireland. His father William built a respectable farm through brutal labor and sacrifice, and he expected Henry to continue the family legacy. On paper, Henry already had stability. Land, livestock, and a future were waiting for him. But there was a problem. Henry hated farming with an intensity that frightened even the people closest to him. While other boys accepted the rhythm of farm life, Henry became obsessed with machinery. At 13 years old, his father gave him a pocket watch. Instead of protecting it, Henry tore it apart piece by piece, studied every gear, and rebuilt it perfectly. Soon, neighbors started bringing broken watches to the farm because the teenager could fix what adults could not. That small detail mattered more than anyone realized at the time. Henry Ford was not fascinated by objects themselves. He was fascinated by systems. He wanted to understand how things worked so he could rebuild them better. 2. The death that changed everything. In 1876, Henry's mother Mary died unexpectedly after childbirth complications. He was only 12 years old. The emotional impact shattered him. Years later, Henry admitted he never truly loved the farm itself. He loved his mother. Without her, the entire place felt empty and unbearable. And that is when the distance between Henry and the future his father imagined became impossible to ignore. At 16, Henry made a decision that changed his life forever. He left the farm and moved to Detroit with almost no money and no real connections. The city was exploding with industrial growth. Factories, steam engines, and electricity were beginning to reshape America, and Henry absorbed everything around him. He worked long hours as an apprentice machinist while teaching himself engineering skills at night. But the real turning point came in the mid-1880s when he saw a gasoline engine for the first time. What happened next changed everything. Henry became consumed by the belief that engines could someday replace horses entirely. 3. The obsession that nearly ruined his life. By the early 1890s, Henry Ford had secured a stable job at Edison Illuminating Company in Detroit. It was respectable work with real advancement opportunities, especially for a young man without formal education. From the outside, it looked like success. But behind the scenes, Henry was living a second life. Every night after work, he disappeared into a small workshop behind his house to experiment with gasoline engines while most people slept. On Christmas Eve in 1893, Henry and his wife Clara tested a tiny homemade engine in their kitchen. The machine rattled violently, filled the room with smoke, and barely stayed together. But it ran. That moment convinced Henry that his vision was real. 3 years later, he completed his first automobile, the quadricycle. There was only one problem. The vehicle was too wide to fit through the shed door. At 4 in the morning, after years of work, Henry grabbed an axe, smashed through the brick wall of the building, and drove the machine into the streets of Detroit. That scene perfectly captured who he was becoming, a man willing to destroy barriers with his own hands if necessary. 4. Rejected, humiliated, and forced to start again. Investors soon noticed Henry's invention, and in 1899 he helped launch the Detroit Automobile Company. It looked like the breakthrough he had been chasing for years. But the company collapsed quickly. Investors wanted fast profits, while Henry obsessed over redesigning and improving every detail. The cars were too expensive, production moved too slowly, and the business failed in less than 2 years. Most people would have taken that as a warning. Henry Ford treated it like unfinished business. Then things became even worse. His second venture, the Henry Ford Company, exploded into conflict almost immediately. Investors forced him out of the business that literally carried his own name. The humiliation was enormous, and the company he lost would later evolve into Cadillac, one of Ford's future rivals. By his late 30s, Henry had already failed publicly twice. He had lost credibility, money, and trust. But during that chaos, he discovered something critical: racing. In 1901, Henry built a race car and defeated famous driver Alexander Winton in front of a massive crowd near Detroit. Overnight, newspapers across America suddenly knew his name. The victory attracted new investors and gave him one last chance. 5. The decision that put America on wheels. In 1903, Ford Motor Company officially launched with around $28,000 in capital. Henry Ford was 40 years old and starting over again after multiple humiliating failures. But this time his vision became sharper than ever. He did not want to build luxury toys for wealthy elites. He wanted to build a reliable automobile cheap enough for ordinary working families. Most experts thought the idea was ridiculous. Cars were expensive machines for the rich. Henry believed mass production could change that forever. Then came the Model T in 1908. Simple, durable, affordable, and strong enough for rough American roads, it exploded across the country. Farmers bought them. Doctors used them to reach patients faster. Families traveled farther than they ever imagined possible. But demand created another crisis. Ford's factories could not build cars quickly enough. So Henry introduced the moving assembly line in 1913. The impact was staggering. Assembly time dropped from more than 12 hours to barely 90 minutes. Prices fell dramatically while production skyrocketed. Within a few years, nearly half the automobiles on Earth were Fords. The poor farm boy from Michigan had transformed not only transportation, but the entire global manufacturing system. Henry Ford died in 1947, with a fortune worth the equivalent of hundreds of billions today. But the most fascinating part of his story is not the money, it is the contrast. A boy who once repaired watches by candlelight on a small farm ended up reshaping modern industry itself. The roads people drove on, the factories companies built, and the way products were manufactured across the world all carried the fingerprints of his obsession. And maybe that is why Henry Ford's story still feels so powerful more than a century later. Because it was never really just about cars. It was about refusing to accept the future other people chose for you. So what do you think was Henry Ford's greatest strength? His vision or his refusal to quit? And could someone like him still build an empire from nothing today? Subscribe for more stories like this, because the world's biggest empires often begin in the places nobody expects.